Okay, so lately you might be feeling a little bit the ripples of what's going on globally when it comes to the economy. The sense of uncertainty, especially when we talk about trade and how different countries are, working together or not working together.
Yeah, it can definitely feel like a lot's up in the air right now. And that's why I think today's deep dive is so important. We're going to be looking at the China Development Forum, which just wrapped up in Beijing.
Yeah, it just happened in March. And it's a really crucial gathering because
I think what makes this forum so important to pay attention to is the timing. We've got this backdrop of potential new U.S. tariffs that could be coming down the line from President Trump's administration.
Yeah, exactly. And that makes all of the conversations and all the little hints, the signals coming out of this forum even more important for the bigger picture of global trade.
It really does.
So in this deep dive, we really want to unpack those, the most important discussions, the kind of hidden messages, and try to figure out what it all means, especially for the relationship between the U.S. and China on trade, and for the whole idea of like a globally open economy.
Yeah, we need to understand how all the pieces fit together.
Right. And to do that, we've been looking at a bunch of different sources, news articles and briefings all about the forum to try and give you the core of what you need to know.
Definitely.
So to kick things off, maybe we could talk about the main message that China seemed to be putting out there.
Sure. I think the central theme that really jumped out was this push against protectionism and a strong kind of recommitment to the idea of globalization.
Okay, so like doubling down on global trade, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And Premier Li Qiang's statements were really key here. He was urging other nations to, open up markets more and calling on businesses to share their resources more, which is interesting given that in some parts of the world we're seeing kind of the opposite trend of countries looking inward.
Right. And he really didn't mince words, did he? I mean, that warning against decoupling and breaking supply chains, that was a pretty strong statement.
It was. And he argued that, going down that path of decoupling would only deepen any crises that are already out there. Plus, there was that powerful line about not wanting to return to the law of the jungle.
That really stuck with me, too. It feels like a pretty deliberate choice of words, right?
I think so. I mean, what's really interesting here is that China is very consciously trying to position itself as, and I'm quoting Premier Li here, a staunch defender and promoter of globalization. So it's a strategic stance, especially in light of all the geopolitical tensions and the pressures that are already on global trade.
Right. So it's not just talk. It's like they're trying to set a specific direction.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Now, alongside this whole, pro-globalization message, there was also this acknowledgement from Beijing that there are some economic challenges coming up. Premier Li even specifically talked about possible unexpected shocks, and he pointed to things happening outside of China as the main source of concern. So what do you think he's really getting at there?
Well, let's be honest. When they talk about external shocks right now, everyone's thinking about the possibility of those U.S. tariffs going up, which we're expecting could happen as early as next month.
Right.
And Premier Li's commitment to, bringing in new policies where necessary to keep the economy running smoothly, I think that's a clear sign that China is getting ready for some bumps in the road.
So they're not just talking. They're actually planning to take action if they need to.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so another big focus at the forum was China's effort to attract foreign investment. And there have been some reports saying that investment going into China has dipped a little bit. So this felt like a pretty key moment for them to address that.
Absolutely.
Why do you think this is such a big deal for them right now?
Here's why you should care about this. Foreign investment is absolutely crucial for China to keep growing its economy and developing new technologies. So Vice Premier Li Qiang spoke directly to foreign business leaders, and he gave them this reassurance that China is absolutely committed to opening up its markets even more and creating a better business environment for them to operate in. What I thought was particularly interesting is that they actually announced a concrete plan.
Okay.
A plan from China's State Council. And this includes some really specific steps, like they're going to ease restrictions in manufacturing and make it simpler for foreign funds to get involved in mergers and acquisitions.
Oh, wow. So real concrete actions.
Yeah, and if they actually put these changes into practice, it could really shift things around in some of the sectors that you might be following.
That's huge. It sounds like a step in the right direction.
It does.
But our sources also made it pretty clear that a lot of foreign businesses still have some big worries. It's not all about the new incentives, right?
You're right. It's more complicated than that. There were some pretty consistent concerns across the board about the geopolitical tensions and the fact that China's putting more emphasis on national security, which can sometimes make things tricky for foreign companies who are trying to do business there. Bill Winters, who's the CEO of Standard Chartered, he even mentioned that consumer credit business within China is slowing down.
Oh, so even within China, there are some signs of things slowing down.
Yeah, suggesting that the domestic economy might not be doing as well as it could be. So that's another thing that's making investors a bit hesitant. So, China's trying to attract that foreign capital, but there are definitely these underlying issues that global businesses are watching very closely.
So it's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now switching gears a little bit, the China Development Forum also became this really interesting platform for some behind-the-scenes diplomacy between the U.S. and China.
Right.
So it wasn't all about economics and business deals.
No, not at all. This forum has actually become a really important, although unofficial way for the U.S. and China to engage with each other. And the fact that Republican Senator Steve Daines was there, that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, his meetings with Vice Premier Li Qiang and Premier Li Qiang, this is the first time that a U.S. politician has gone to China since President Trump came back into office.
It's a pretty significant visit.
It is. And Daines himself said that his meeting with Li was like a first step toward the possibility of talks between Trump and Xi Jinping.
Yeah, which suggests that at least on some level, both sides recognize how important it is to keep that high-level communication going.
Right, because if they're not talking, then things could really escalate.
Exactly. I think what's crucial here is that without those direct conversations between the top leaders, there's a much higher risk of misunderstandings and things accidentally blowing up when it comes to trade. And Premier Li's statement during those meetings where he said that, both countries benefit from cooperation and both lose from confrontation. It might sound familiar, but it means a lot more given the context of these potential tariff hikes.
It definitely hits differently.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Senator Daines representing the U.S. There was also a whole bunch of top executives from big American companies. I mean, we're talking CEOs of companies like Apple, Qualcomm, Pfizer, FedEx, Boeing, Cargill, Medtronic, UL Solutions. They were all there meeting with Chinese leaders.
It was a pretty impressive turnout.
It was. So what do you think that tells us?
Well, I think it really highlights how fundamentally important the Chinese market is for these massive American companies.
Right.
Even with all the geopolitical stuff going on, Stephen Orlins from the National Committee on U.S. China Relations put it really well. He said that a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping is absolutely necessary to make sure policies are moving in a constructive direction and to prevent things from escalating even further when it comes to tariffs and restrictions. So for these companies to be there in person, it really shows you where their long-term priorities are.
Their presence speaks volumes for sure. And this kind of leads us into, I think, what was probably the biggest unspoken issue looming over the whole forum. And that's the threat of new U.S. tariffs.
Yeah, it was definitely the elephant in the room.
It felt like every conversation was happening with that in the background.
Absolutely. The possibility of those new and potentially higher tariffs was just hanging over everything.
Yeah.
Remember, President Trump has already put those extra 20% tariffs on a lot of Chinese imports.
Right.
And now we're getting close to the end of that U.S. review of whether China's been keeping up their end of the Phase 1 trade deal, which should be wrapping up around April 1st.
April 1st.
Okay. And some of our sources have even suggested that there could be sweeping reciprocal duties globally coming out of that review.
Wow. So this could impact way more than just China then.
Exactly. This isn't just about the U.S. and China anymore. There's a real chance that this could lead to some much broader actions on global trade.
It could really shake things up.
It could. And yet, even with all of this uncertainty, you still had all these top executives from huge international companies going to Beijing, which just shows you how important and influential the Chinese market is in the global economy.
It really does. And we even heard from John Abramson Ring, who's the CEO of IKEA. He was talking about how much they believe in open trade.
Yeah.
And Rich Lesser from Boston Consulting Group, he talked about how businesses need to build more flexible supply chains and adapt to these long-term shifts that are happening.
That's a really key point.
It is, because it seems like companies are really trying to figure out how to navigate this new landscape where things are constantly changing.
Yeah.
So when we talk about flexibility, what does that actually look like in practice? Are companies like diversifying who they buy from? Are they setting up production in different places or what?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? For a lot of companies, flexibility means using a whole bunch of different strategies at once. We're seeing some companies move away from having all their suppliers in just one country. They're looking at setting up regional production centers so they don't have to rely on those super long supply chains. And more, they're investing in technology like AI to try and predict disruptions and manage them better. It's all about making their operations more resilient.
Okay, so spreading things out and using technology to kind of stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
Now, on China's side, we also heard about some of the things they're doing to support their economy, given all these potential challenges.
Yeah.
Premier Li confirmed again that the central bank is committed to cutting interest rates and also the reserve requirement ratio when timely.
Right.
Can you remind me what cutting the reserve requirement ratio actually does for the economy?
Sure. So think of the reserve requirement ratio as like the percentage of deposits that banks are required to keep on hand and not lend out. So when they lower this ratio, it basically frees up more money for banks to lend, which should, in theory, boost economic activity because there's more credit available to businesses and people who want to borrow.
Okay, so it's like putting more money into the system to try and get things moving.
Exactly. It's one of the tools that central banks use to try and stimulate growth.
Okay, got it. And they also mentioned a new consumption action plan. So it seems like China's also trying to boost demand inside the country, maybe as a way to protect themselves from any economic problems coming from outside.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. They're trying to strengthen those internal economic drivers to give themselves a more stable base in the face of all this global uncertainty.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what would you say are the absolute key takeaways for us from this deep dive into the China Development Forum?
Okay, so I think the most important things to remember are, first, China sent a very clear message that they are all about global openness, and they are definitely against protectionism. Second, they know that there could be some economic shocks coming up, especially with those potential U.S. tariffs, and they're actively getting ready for that. Third, they're really working hard to attract foreign investment with new programs and reassurances, but foreign businesses are still worried about some of the bigger geopolitical and economic issues. Fourth, the forum was a really important, even though it was unofficial, way for the U.S. and China to have some diplomatic conversations. And it shows how badly they need to have those talks at a higher level. And finally, that threat of U.S. tariffs is still looming over everything, and it's creating a ton of uncertainty for businesses and for the whole global economy.
So much to unpack there. It sounds like we're at a pretty crucial moment with China sort of presenting themselves as the champion of globalization, but at the same time getting ready for some potential storms on the horizon.
Yeah, that's a good summary. I think China's trying to project this image of stability and openness, while at the same time getting ready for the possibility that the rules of global trade might be about to change.
And here's what I think is really interesting for you listening.
Yeah.
Think about how interconnected the global economy is, which was so obvious at this forum. What do you think would happen in your industry or your field if this trend towards protectionism keeps going? What would the long-term impacts be? And what could you or other businesses in your sector do to prepare for that and navigate this increasingly complex global landscape? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.